You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Friday, October 30th, 2020. This week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we have dove headfirst into Jesus' public ministry, which began at the baptism, and then we follow Jesus immediately into the desert where he is tempted by Satan. Now, we are going to wrap up this week by looking at something really cool. Throughout this whole Jesus study, we've been talking a lot about things that happened in the Old Testament and things that happened right before Jesus was born, and then what that meant for him growing up and how people understood what they saw that Jesus did. Now, here is a really cool thing that I want to talk to you about today. All those stories that we read in the Old Testament, in a really real way, Jesus did all of those things again, but where in the Old Testament we saw people sin and do them wrong and fail, Jesus does all of those things again, but he does them the right way. Now, we can't talk about every single story from the Old Testament, but I want to talk to you about just a couple. So the first one I want you to think about is the story of the Israelite nation in the desert. Remember, God freed them from slavery. With his prophet Moses, he led them out of Egypt through the Red Sea and then to the bottom of Mount Sinai where he gave them the 10 Commandments. And he told them he would lead them to their own land, a land flowing with milk and honey. To get there, however, they had to cross the desert. And that time in the desert, God tested them. He was trying to teach them obedience to his law so that he could truly show them how to be free and happy. But again and again, the Israelites doubt. They turn away from God, even though he has just led them out of slavery through the Red Sea. And even during this time, Moses, the great prophet, he even doubts God at one point. In fact, the punishment for him doubting God is that he's not allowed to enter the promised land with the Israelites. He stays back. So that time of test and temptation in the desert. Well, does that sound similar to anything that we've just talked about with Jesus? It should. The Israelites wandered for 40 years. Jesus goes into the desert to fast and pray for how long? 40 days. While he is there, he is tested. He is tempted. And yet, unlike Moses, unlike the Israelites, he stays true, he is obedient, and he leaves determined to do God's will. Now, the other story that I want you to bring to mind, especially with this time when Jesus is in the desert being tempted, is another very familiar story from the Bible where two people also encounter Satan. And they don't resist temptation. Can you think of that story? Well, of course, that story is the story of Adam and Eve. Now, recall what happens there. Remember, they're in this beautiful garden. They're totally happy and united with each other and with God. And there's only one little rule in this garden. Eat whatever you want. There's everything you could possibly want here. I simply say, do not eat from this tree. But of course, Satan enters the garden. He spins his web of lies, the same lies that he tries to trick Jesus with. Lies about pride and, eating too much and all these other lies. He tries to convince Adam and Eve that God actually doesn't have their best intentions in mind, that God is withholding something from them. And of course, they give into temptation. They commit the first sin, original sin, that separates all of humanity from God. And it is that sin that leads to all other sins. So once again, Jesus, he acts out, or he does these same stories from the Old Testament, but he does them right. And so this is why we call Jesus the new Adam. Of course, Adam was the first man. All human beings were born because of that original first family of Adam and Eve. But we are now part of something different. Our new brother, the new leader of our family, is Jesus Christ, a human being like us who was confronted with Satan and temptation, but he did it right. He said no. And so, Sprouts, we've spent a lot of time talking about sin and temptation this week. So my challenge for you, if you are old enough, is to recall the last time that you celebrated the sacrament of reconciliation and discuss with your parents if it's time for you to go again. Oftentimes we can lose track of how long it has been. And this is just a friendly reminder to go back, to enjoy God's mercy, and to receive that sacrament. If your church is in a strange time where with COVID, that's not readily available, I encourage you to try to reach out to your priest and ask perhaps if they'll come to your house for reconciliation, or if you can set up some other special arrangement. If you have yet to receive the sacrament of reconciliation, I encourage you to take time to recall your sins privately and to beg God for forgiveness. That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God created you to be. Just one more thing, we are running a really fun sale on our Rosary board books and our saint patterns for cross-stitch and melty beads. The sale runs through the end of October, so I encourage you to check it out by checking the links in this podcast episode.